That could benefit people by creating more demand for labor, and so they wouldn't have as many people working at minimum wage. The trade agreements have tended to drive down wages in this country, and I voted against every one of these so-called free trade agreements, and I'm going to oppose these three if Obama proposes them. The Bush wrote that he's going to support maybe, because that's going to lose more jobs and put more downward pressure on wages in this country. So part of it has to do with our international policy and how we're trying to make Americans compete with people who get paid $1 an hour or Mexico or whatever they get paid in China. I guess wages are up in China now. They're up to $4 or $5 a day or something. It's like way more competitive. And, so there's that. Seniors are not quite so rosy because actually the last 2 years, even though seniors and I think all Americans have experienced substantial inflation in things you have to buy, the Consumer Price Index, which is constructed in a different way, says there hasn't been inflation. So for 2 years in a row, seniors have not gotten a cost of living increase. Now, if you look at what seniors buy on a limited income, obviously they consume more medical care than younger people. So prescription drugs, they've gone up substantially, even for the same drugs. I get to put 2 drops in the side twice a day. I've been getting the drugs for years. My co-payment on my insurance has gone from 30-something bucks up to 70-something bucks for the same 2 tiny little vials of drugs in 2 years. So I know that's happening to seniors too. So, okay, that sounds like inflation to me because there's no other drops I can use, and so there's that. Same thing happens to seniors. Seniors got to buy food. Food prices are up generally for a number of reasons. Fuel prices are definitely up. Housing, maybe not so much, but if they're paying rent or a mortgage, or it's fixed, it doesn't go down. So they are experiencing inflation, yet they've gotten no cost of living increase. There should be something, and I've supported this for years, called the CPI, and I didn't name it. It was named by the Department of Labor because they've done a model for it. The CPIEs, cost of Consumer Price Index for elderly. Looking at a market basket, which is what they call it, of things seniors buy or have to buy, and adjusting their benefits on that. I've advocated that since the mid-90s, and that would give them more regular cost of living increases. There's actually, interestingly enough, a big national movement in the other direction saying we have overcompensated seniors and veterans and anybody who's on an adjustment because we've overstated inflation. And I'm like, no, and this is based on, and they want to do something called a chained CPI, which is very technical, but the bottom line is this: there's something called a substitution effect if you're an economist. Substitution effect means you're buying hamburger goes up. Say, okay, well, I'm going to buy ground turkey. Okay, you go over and buy ground turkey. And then you say to the economist, well, there's inflation because I always buy hamburger, the price went up. They say, no, there's no inflation. You're eating, you bought ground turkey. Because that's substitution. So there's no real inflationary impact. It's just crazy. It's a crazy thing. I mean, the price of beef went up, the price of milk went up. So it's inflation. And they don't measure that. And they don't want to measure that. In fact, they want to make it so they would never measure that with a chained CPI. And seniors would probably never get another cost of living increase on Social Security. And they say, well, that's all Social Security problem done, and now we won't give cost of living increases. It doesn't solve it for the seniors, but it could solve it for the Social Security Trust Fund. So I wouldn't say it's quite so rosy for the seniors the last few years, but no, there are a heck of a lot of people struggling to get by. I was serving meals at Food for Lane County yesterday. A lot of homeless people, but there were people who weren't homeless who were there who were working. And they're in there to get a free dinner because they're working at the minimum wage and they got a few kids and things are pretty tight. And there was one woman there and there were 3 kids, and we talked for a little bit, and she works, but she can't make ends meet. So you're right, and that goes to what level you set the minimum wage at and whether or not you index it. And that's not, yes sir.
Sir, when I meet you or any of the other people from the Congress or anywhere, or even the House here, everybody individually comes across very reasonable, very intelligent. But as a group, what's the conflict?
Are you a group psychologist?
I'm actually impressed by each one of you when I meet you.
Yeah, well, I'm not impressed by all my colleagues. So
I'm just saying, when you guys are together, what is the Tea Party doing to Republicans? And and what are the extra liberals are doing to Democrats? Why is that dynamic so great today?
Okay.
And the other quick question is, what's gonna happen to nuclear plants?
Okay. There's a very good question about the partisan divisions, and I have sort of, from my opinion, everybody's got different opinions, but I think there are two principal drivers. And in the House, one principal driver is the way we do redistricting. The census says every 10 years we do a national census and then we draw new congressional districts. We haven't increased the number of congressional districts since 1916, so the districts keep getting bigger. And so we have 435 members of the House. But they now have these great programs that you can buy, you know, that will redistrict any way you want. Say, okay, here's my state, here's the number of Democrats, Independents, Republicans. Here's the performance in the last 25 years over all the elections. You crank it all on the computer and say, give me, we've got 6 seats, give us 4 Republican, 2 Democrat. The computer can do it. Now, they might look a little weird, but the computer can do it. And this is going on more and more. There are very few competitive districts left. I have a competitive district. You know, Kurt Schrader has a competitive district, or Blumenauer could die and get reelected in his district. I mean, it's not competitive. It's all about the primary election. And that's a problem on both sides of the aisle, because it drives the Democrats to the extreme and it drives the Republicans to the extreme. I'll give an example on the Republican side, since I just criticize the Democrat, but I had a friend named Wayne Gilchrist, was a sort of moderate liberal member of Congress from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Republican, and he upset Grover Norquist, the guy I mentioned earlier. And Grover said, we'll get you, and he did. He contacted the Club for Growth. The Club for Growth put $2 million into an unknown right-wing Republican, and they beat Wayne in the primary. It's not, but you're not going to have a significant Democratic challenge in that district because it's a Republican district. So they drug the district to the right because they can do that, and both parties do that, and we're just going through redistricting. And to me, the solution to this would be what Iowa's been doing for 2 decades, which is they have a group, I think it's retired judges, I don't know who it is, but they have some sort of bipartisan, nonpartisan group that draws up the state and federal districts. They have very competitive elections. In fact, 3 of my colleagues from Iowa have been put in other people's districts because a nonpartisan commission drew it up. They didn't say, well, we gotta protect him. Here, we'll put his hometown in here and draw it this way. They just drew it up and said, this makes sense for Iowa. Here's some pretty compact districts. Here are communities of interest. Good luck, you know? And California is experimenting with it now. They have some much larger group of people, citizenry, somehow chosen to do the redistricting. We'll say, I think we would be better served to move away from scientific partisan-based redistricting. You can't make every district competitive. I mean, there are going to be places that are going to still be partisan, totally in the primary, but you could reduce it from today. That's probably, you know, depends on who you want to believe, but it's probably 70% of the districts are not competitive beyond the primary or barely competitive beyond the primary. You can probably move that to more than 50. That would give you a much different tenor in Congress. And the other thing is money. If you're going to please the big money, and you're afraid always looking over your shoulder at the big money, particularly as it's been unleashed now by the Supreme Court, you're not going to be very representative of the people he's talking about who want to see maybe a minimum wage increase or minimum wage that's indexed. You're going to go, whoa, I can't do that, because they're going to come in here with a couple $1 million anonymously and take me out. So the flood of money, and I addressed that earlier with the constitutional amendment that would allow us to regulate the amount of money and the source of the money and the contributions that go into elections. I kind of like the British system where people running for parliament can't advertise on television, and the election lasts for whatever period of time it is. It's pretty short. Anyway, yeah, second question, which is nuclear power. There are 3 big problems and have been with nuclear power. One is cost, because they've all been mostly one-off designs. You need, the second is obviously there's concern about safety, moving parts, valves, that kind of thing. Degradation over time because of the effect of radioactivity. And the third is waste storage. Now, I think I've visited over here to Corvallis and OSU, and there's some people associated with the university called NuScale, who have the idea of very small, standardized nuclear reactors that don't have moving parts. Okay, well, that seems to address number 1, cost, and number 2, safety and potential for terrorism. Because I tell you, nuclear plants, as currently constituted, as we found out in Japan, are terrorist targets waiting to happen, because if you can get their backup power and get the power coming into the plant, you might be able to, and you can hold off the reinforcements that try and come in there, you can cause a meltdown. And don't think there aren't people who haven't thought about that. And that's why we are now really amped up security at nuclear plants. But you couldn't do that with a new scale plant. And so there's some, but we still have the waste issue. And that hasn't been resolved, and it's a big problem. You're creating something that's dangerous for 10,000 years. At one point, the Department of Energy came up with the idea of how do you communicate danger over 10,000 years. They actually came up with the idea of a nuclear priesthood. I mean, they really did back in the 60s. They said, we will have a verbal tradition, you know, and other things. You know, Nevada has been found potentially to be unstable, you know, over geologic time, because you're talking 10,000 years. And so all the money that was spent there, it seems like we're not going to use that repository. I would take and put the waste that we have today in what are called transportable casks, and I would move it all to Nevada and put it in the desert until we figure out what to do with it long term. But the law doesn't allow that, because it says if you're looking at a place for a permanent repository, they can't be the temporary repository. There are people who a few years ago proposed Oregon down around Fields as the temporary repository, which I was somewhat bitterly opposed to. So, you know, that's still the big problem, and that's still a cloud on the industry over the future. So yes.